It's really good to be here. I shared with some leaders today one of the reasons why I came to New Zealand when there were lots of opportunities once the pandemic ended to travel. But I came because I felt a real sense that there was a strategic moment that I had to come and speak into something. It's one of the things I do is I speak into different countries and cities and different places around the world. It's something God's called me to. And as an Australian, you get a little bit of cachet doing that. You know, you turn up to certain places and people want to talk to you about kangaroos and your accent and so on. But I also realised that coming to New Zealand is one of those places where perhaps the cachet is not there. I realised this the first time I came to New Zealand and, wandered, this is before that visit, my very first visit, the first time I spoke here, I think it was like a youth pastor or something, and came across and wandered into the sort of gift store at Auckland airports and saw there's books like jokes about Australians. Oh, this is really bizarre. There was a T-shirt saying, "We go for the All Blacks and whoever is playing against Australia," and it was just a bizarre experience. I remember on that camp, someone just came out and this young teenager just shoved into my face this really thick book, and then turned it around and was like, "Jokes about Australians." I'm like, "You're weird." And it was interesting, though, because in many ways, I think the thought was captured. There was an article written by New Zealand's High Commissioner in Australia, and she basically said it's really weird. What she discovered living in Australia and interacting with Australians is that it's an asymmetrical relationship. In a way, New Zealanders' relationship with Australia is not how Australians see New Zealanders. And Australians have a very warm view of New Zealanders. What does that say? The other way? I'm not sure. But I think it captured, there was, knowing I was coming, I was recently in the UK and I ended up getting COVID, getting stuck there. I was able to watch Australia's World Cup qualifier live instead of 4 a.m. in the morning back in Melbourne. And then I watched the next night, New Zealand's tragic World Cup qualifier to get to Qatar, which was a tragedy. But it was interesting in the crowd when there was a disallowed goal, the camera panned to the New Zealand fans jumping up and down before VAR tragically overruled it. But what was interesting is there was actually a stack of Aussie fans who had paid to stay on to watch and cheer for New Zealand. And I think it actually captures the spirit of why I feel like I'm here. When I saw that, I felt there's something prophetic in that. And I feel that part of the reason God got me to come here, say no to other things, is there is a prophetic cheering on. Because I actually think that New Zealand is very strategically placed at this moment. And perhaps New Zealand doesn't see that of itself. In the Asian century, which we're moving into, New Zealand finds itself straddling both the East and West. Also a gateway to the Pacific, a country which is sort of part of the West. There's what is even the West anymore? That concept is completely being sort of turned on its head since the war in Ukraine. And I think New Zealand's actually positioned in the world with lots of soft power. People love Kiwis around the world. Everywhere I go in the world, you'll find a New Zealander doing something. And so I feel at this moment that perhaps for a while, New Zealand's sight has been inward. But there's actually, yes, there's something that God wants to do here, but there's also something outward that God is calling this nation to. So that's the spirit I come to cheer on. But I want to add a different dimension tonight. So I think, yes, God strategically called me to come to New Zealand. But also, I think God strategically wanted me to speak to you as an individual tonight. At this particular moment, we are in a moment. This is not normal. The last 2 years have not been normal. It is strange. I never forget not traveling. People all of a sudden realized they could reach me via Zoom. And I spent a lot of 20 and 21 speaking to believers, leaders, different people all around the world, every continent. And there was all this different stuff happening, pressure in every country. But there was also something very personal that I noticed as I spoke to people. The conversation would begin about these big issues I'm talking about, what's happening in the world, how the world's changing, the pandemic, but then how things keep changing. But I noticed there was this really similar personal dynamic that people are experiencing. And I want to dig into that tonight. But I want to posit that in a really positive way. Sam outlined there some of the pressures that we've experienced in the world, what you've experienced here in New Zealand, the tiredness, the polarization, the lack of markers in the world, the questioning that we can't really predict the future. What will the future look like? But I want to posit my big idea tonight that I want to communicate to you, a guy in a Socceroos shirt cheering on New Zealand, is I want to argue why I think our changing and complex world will create a remnant of renewed Christians. And what if you're one of them? What if in this moment God wants to have a moment with you? And what if in that moment God does something new? So I want to begin with a scripture, Mark, the best named book in the Bible, 4, verse 13, where Jesus is speaking to the disciples. He's spoken about the parable of the sower, and he speaks it to the crowd in this parabolic form, but then he explains to the disciples, where he explains this clearly. It says this, "Then Jesus said to them, 'Don't you understand this parable? How then will you understand any parable? The farmer sows the word. Some people are like seed along the path where the word is sown. As soon as they hear it, Satan comes and takes away the word that was sown in them. Others, like seeds sown on rocky places, hear the word and at once receive it with joy. But since they have no root, they only last a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. Still others, like seeds sown among the thorns, hear the word, but the worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth, and the desire for other things come in and choke the word, making it unfruitful.'" But I want to focus on this verse 20. "Others, like seed sown on good soil, hear the word, accept it, and produce a crop, some 30, some 60, some 100 times what was sown." God, as we spend this time, these few minutes here in 2022, I just want to pray that your Spirit hovers over this moment. We recognize that we are people who have spiritual seeds planted in us. Your word. And I just want to pray in this moment that you really speak to every person in this room. You have brought people here who you've been speaking to for a long time. Some people who are tired, some people who are confused, some people who are excited, some people who are a mix of both. But we just recognize that you are here, you are present. This whole time you're whispering, you're guiding. And so we just come to attention now to what you're doing amongst us. In Indonesia, on August the 27th, 1883, a volcanic eruption 10,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb ripped apart the Indonesian island of Krakatoa. People heard the sound as far away as Saigon, Bangkok, Manila, and Perth. As the sky turned red and rained rock, the churchgoers on nearby islands shuddered and people feared it was the end of days. The blast almost instantaneously killed over 36,000 people, destroying more than 3/4 of the island. The entire planet experienced a raft of environmental effects. Dramatic sunsets and strange phenomena in the sky took place for months. In North America, fire brigades were regularly called as people thought there was a fire somewhere. Some of you might be familiar with the Norwegian painter Edvard Munch, who painted the famous Scream image, where there's almost a skeletal face screaming sort of into the existential void, and behind the sky is all these incredible colours. That was a result of what was happening in the sky at that moment because of Krakatoa. It looked like the world itself was on fire. Now, interestingly, 7 weeks after Krakatoa had burst apart, I would say foolhardy Dutch engineer and a small team ventured onto the island. Landing, they found the shape and form of the island completely rearranged. Much of what was once solid had slipped into the sea. And two of its well-known mountain peaks that operated as sort of visual sites that sailors would see were completely vanished. The very shape of Krakatoa had been refashioned, birthing an entirely new terrain. Now, before the eruption, Situated, in the tropics, near the equator, Krakatoa was a thick blanket of trees and plants, teeming with animals and insects. Yet now in a moment, all of the animal and plant life was vanquished. Its surface turned into a chaotic mess of volcanic rock and ash. The island lay in this in-between state, not completely obliterated, yet neither able to bear life. The lifeless ground sat in the sea like the formless earth we read of in Genesis 1. I thought a lot about Krakatoa in Melbourne during the 2020 lockdown. Just before the lockdown, I would often think about my city and all the potential it had. There's so many distractions. Melbourne was like this magnet that people would come to. When I'd speak somewhere else in another state in Australia or even New Zealand, there'd often be a line of graphic designers and aspiring baristas wanting to move to Melbourne. But then all of a sudden, all of the options in my city turned off. You didn't see people. And it was like for a while, as these different, very long lockdowns, almost for 2 years, we were bobbing. You would bob under into this lockdown and go into this sort of suspended state of animation. At the beginning, everyone wanted to get fit and bake sourdough bread and learn all these things. I don't know, learn Portuguese or something. Everyone was being the best homeschooling parent. The teachers were running extracurricular activities. I remember my boys were doing the backyard Olympics and we're trying to film it with iPhones. It was like go, go, go. But every time you came up for water and you thought it was over, you went back down again. And then the weird dynamic for us in Melbourne, probably similar to perhaps what Auckland went through a little bit, but in a bigger scale, was that this was happening at a time when the rest of Australia and New Zealand was COVID zero, living their best lives. For people in Melbourne, the religion is AFL football, and to have the grand final, the ultimate sporting thing in our city, happen in Perth. And Perth hold this over us. And I'll never forget, they were showing on the news, it's not the MCG, the temple of alternate religion in Melbourne. It was here it's in Perth. And they had this camera shot, I don't know, it was on a drone, and they came down, there were just all these people in Perth, sitting outdoors, drinking beer without masks. And it was sucked in Melbourne, is what I felt like. And you had this bizarre reality that as you came up, things looked different. We couldn't go more than 5 kilometres. At 8 o'clock, the city went silent. I couldn't walk past my front garden. And I remember actually walking to my front garden and just thought, I never thought in my life that my city would fall silent. You begin to see animal life rocking around. It was weird in the city. One day, my wife literally saw a kangaroo running down our street, something I told Americans never happens in Australia. But what I noticed was the change in my church. What I noticed was the change in my friends. What I noticed was going downtown, which a buzz of activity, and all of a sudden there's empty shops. And I realized that in a moment, the world had been changed. But what I also noticed, that's the sociological, that's the big picture, is that our interior world's changed. People began to think differently. They began to re-examine. Everything changed in rapid time. One of the big questions that people would ask me was, particularly probably in the first half of 2021, the debate was, are we going to go back to what it was like in 2019, or has this changed things? What we saw very quickly was that this was about more than just COVID. In a sense, the world was this connected network. It made very clear by the fact that all of a sudden COVID became a supply chain issue. COVID all of a sudden then made a jobs issue. I can't remember if it was in Australia or Britain, and we're both having significant airport troubles, but I think maybe it's in the UK, they need 15,000 more people to work at airports because people quit during the pandemic. All of a sudden, something that began with the virus in Wuhan, all of a sudden means that people are having their vacations cancelled in 2022. But then we come out of the pandemic into a war in Europe. We see all kinds of tensions in different countries, everything from issues around racism to farmers' rights, all of these things in this time. It's like all of the pressure came and stuff that was underground or there or ignored or whatever came up. And we realized this was bigger than just the pandemic. We are living through a moment of rapid and escalating changes. And these changes are more than just being about technological advancement. They're reshaping our culture, our cities, our economy, our world, and our private lives. Randall Schwaller, the political scientist, says this of this moment: we are entering a chaotic period where most anything can happen and little can be predicted. Richard Robb, James Manica, and Jonathan Wurtzel say this: we are living poised at a set of historical, technological, economic, political, and social inflection points. The Industrial Revolution pales in comparison to today's convulsions because the shifts today are happening much faster and on a bigger scale. Because they're so interlinked, they amplify one another. The changes are harder to anticipate and more powerful in their impact. We are in a moment. Now, so often we've seen these things, the terrorist attack at an airport in Turkey, where perhaps you see the vision on your phone, looking at the news that morning, and yes, it captures you because you've got that sense of human connection with the faces. But particularly for us in Australia and New Zealand, often this stuff seemed like it was on the other side of the world. So we're able to dodge these global upheavals. But in a networked world, which brings everything close, no longer is that true. But this is also true of us personally. These big picture items that are happening in the world are crashing into our reality. And I think the phase we're going into next, increasingly people are talking about the fact that the standards of living that we are used to in the developed world are about to change. To perhaps the best days are before us. Damien Sambrook, British historian, just wrote an article saying the golden age of travel is over. That maybe you look back in 10 years and go, man, we're getting a cheap flight to Europe, or maybe when middle-class people could afford to go to Europe. That's just one example of the many changes coming before us as we sort of stand now looking at a significant potential economic recession. So this is a moment for the world, but it's a moment for you. But to help understand this, I just want to touch on a framework of understanding really quickly. My argument is that we're not entering into a new phase, we're entering into an in-between phase. We've not entered into a new era, we're at the end of an era, this phase of living, which perhaps went for sort of 30 or 40 years, where we lived through this incredible era of peace and prosperity. And New Zealand and Australia, our two countries, were probably at the apex of that. Incredible, peaceful societies, standards of living that we thought were normal, that were literally incredibly abnormal in the history of humanity and in our planet today. And we took that as baseline. That's what a lot of the people we've been trying to live around and disciple and share the gospel with just took that as normal. I think we took it as normal. But what I realized is we're actually in the in-between, the no man's land between two eras, a grey zone. When I was a kid, I watched a movie called The Third Man with Orson Welles. And I never liked the movie because I remember watching movies where I wanted to know who the bad guys were and the good guys. So the bad guys and the good guys were. And classically, when you watch those like World War II movies, it was clear that the Americans or the British were the good guys and the Nazis were the bad guys. The Third Man's really weird because it begins just after the war. There's guys rocking around in German uniforms, but they're sort of now just army who's trying to keep the peace. The war is over. The central villain of the movie is actually a character called Harry Lime, played by Orson Welles. And the final scene is of this man who's gone corrupt, an American who's actually gone corrupt in Austria, part of what was Nazi Germany. And the final scene is he's being chased in these subterranean sewers by the German army with the full-on Nazi helmets, and it turns all the categories on its head. You want the guys in the German uniforms to catch the American. And as a kid, it just played with my brain. I could not understand this movie because the categories were messed up. But really what the movie is showing is that weird space. It's not World War II, where it's very clear. It's that period after World War II, where who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? I think that's a moment that we're in now. This grey zone is what I call it. This strange, confusing, fragmented time between eras, where one era is still here, but sort of fading, losing its power, and we can see the next era coming of perhaps robotics and AI, but it's not here fully. We think the world's going to head in one direction, but then it takes this real crazy turn. For example, in 2015, when the US Supreme Court passed the Act on Gay Marriage, it looked like there's this clear trajectory that what's going to happen in American law is going to continue to make more and more progressive laws. But then here, plot twist, here we have the Supreme Court now changed and making a ruling around Roe versus Wade, which is made by conservative judges. No one expected that. You are going to see increasingly things in your lifetime you never expected to see. Plot twists, changes. This is what it's like to live in a grey zone. It's this in-between period between living in the overlap. Now, grey zone is the context in which you will live, in which you will follow Jesus. We must understand it in order to flourish within it. But to flourish, we have to understand they bring a particular challenge to us. In a grey zone, like in me watching The Third Man as a young kid, I couldn't work out the markers. My marker was, guys in Nazi helmets bad, American good. Those markers were gone. How you understand the world was gone. So that's true of our culture. Everyone's trying to work out what the world looks like at this moment. But also we're trying to work that out personally. What are the markers? Who am I? Who am I connected to? One of the lessons I learned through the pandemic is people who I thought were deeply committed to my church, committed to me, weren't. People I thought I was connected with who wouldn't change, changed. People actually far from Jesus came close to Jesus, and people who were close to Jesus then became far from Jesus. And this happened to everyone. People changed careers, everyone seemed to become an introvert in Melbourne, even people who were extroverts. All of these changes happen, and we're looking for some sort of guidebook of where I am. So this moment brings a particular challenge to us. I've just vomited lots of information on you. Let's have a quick pause. Turn to the person next to you. How has grey zone challenged you personally? Discuss that with someone perhaps you've never met next to you in a real grey zone moment. One of the really interesting things I think about the grey zone moment is the way it even seems to eat away the new thing. Some of you, as mentioned, were familiar with This Cultural Moment, podcast that I did with my friend John Mark. It was interesting at that moment, we were doing this podcast, there was this moment where it just seemed like there was this new collection of different churches in these really sort of progressive, secular urban centres, and we were talking to our friends in places like New York and London and Portland and Melbourne. I remember there was one episode where we talked about how we'd been in Heart Coffee in Portland before, as we often would talk before we recorded, and there were these two Danish girls next to us. And long story short, the conversation about how people were panicking, but actually the face of our city still looks so beautiful. That for all this fear about change, actually nothing was changing. Portland, downtown, nice coffee shops. Melbourne, similar, nice place downtown. I would have never thought that only a couple of years after that, Portland downtown now is like trashed. Portland had almost 100 days non-stop of rioting every night. Now, if you said that to me, that could happen in America, I could sort of believe it. You see these things often happen in America, but I could not believe that I would see rioting in my own city. For 2 days, it just went on. In some of the most normally culturally held sacred sites, the Westgate Bridge, which in, I think, 1973 collapsed, this bridge which had this tremendous loss of life, people writing on that, people writing at the War Memorial, the Anzac Myth, I thought was absolutely sacred in Australia and New Zealand. And here it is, people in that space, this bizarre scenes. I remember when the Capitol riot thing happened, a lot of people looked at that, particularly as we do, say, in Australia, New Zealand and Canada, and thought, that's America. Look at them running into their legislature. That would never happen here. Go forward. Parliament House in Canberra being set alight. Images of Wellington Parliament, fires out the front, barricades, Ottawa, Parliament Hill. These things that we thought we would never see. And it was just fascinating to see Portland, this city which I'd done this podcast about, and how do we deal with this progressive thing. One of the biggest churches in Portland now is a church which has fully aligned itself with the hard right. and actually has these sermons where they'll sort of play clips of Joe Biden and sort of make fun of it. It's just totally bizarre phenomenon. Who could have seen that happening? That they are one of the biggest churches in Poland is this really sort of hard right church. So even the new thing changes. And that's confronting. When you think that you're the forefront of something new, here's this cultural moment, all these people listening to it. But then things change again. And I thought more about Krakatoa. I thought about Krakatoa, and I went and again picked up Simon Winchester's book about Krakatoa. And I remember when I first read about Krakatoa, I was fascinated. My dad told me about it when I was a kid, this explosion. So I read the book maybe, 15 years ago, or whenever it came out, Simon Winchester's book on Krakatoa. I re-borrowed it in the midst of the pandemic. And what I became more interested in is not the first act of Krakatoa, this incredible explosion, that's all exciting, but the second act. So 3 years after that initial visit to Krakatoa by that Dutch engineer, another expedition landed upon the island. And instead of burnt, barren ground, the landing party discovered that life had again taken hold in the most unlikely of places. Mosses, algae, flowering plants, and even species of fern had flourished. How these plants managed to grow in such a barren environment. What happened was algae and moss from the sea had gone over this sort of rock of what was there and created what's sort of this substrata. And then tiny seeds carried by the currents of the sea or birds in their dropping had triggered this miraculous renewal of life upon the devastated island. Seeds beget seeds. Seeds turn into fruit. And fruit again turns into seeds, and the cycle of multiplication occurs. A year after that, another expedition arrived on the island and discovered, in the words of Simon Winchester, that there'd been a rampant growth. There now were dense fields of grasses so tall that a man could hide himself. Today, Krakatoa, or Anak Krakatoa, son of Krakatoa, is a repository of an ecosystem of literally thousands of plants, dense forests, and is home to hundreds of animal species. This tells us something really, really key at this moment. When viewed through a biblical lens, these grey zone moments, which seem like the end of an era, this period of destruction, often precede renewal and rebirth. In the biblical accounts of creation, we encounter the unformed earth in its chaotic form. It's pregnant with the potential of creation. The Spirit hovers over the water. In the formless earth we encounter in Genesis 1 exists in an in-between state, a grey zone, but a grey zone that is waiting for birth, seeded by a divine hand. When reframed biblically, the phase that feels like destruction, mayhem, and death is actually the moment just before rebirth. And so moments like this, in between grey zone moments, are filled with potential. They're the moments over which the Spirit of God hovers, waiting to bring new creations. Yes, they're filled with pressure and chaos and disappointment and disruption, yet they're also where God does something exceptional inside his people, calling believers to him in a new and a more honest and profound way. What looked like destruction on Krakatoa was actually the phase before germination. Now, the media is only going to talk about destruction at the moment. The media is only going to talk about disruption at the moment. But as believers, we need to have spiritual eyes that we see what's going on in the world, we take it seriously, but also we realize that there is germination happening at this moment. The devastation actually created a blank page over which a new story could be told. The grey zone can become with God a seedbed of renewal. Krakatoa reminds us that what may look like decline, loss, or obliteration can be revival's launching pad. For such renewal to occur, all it takes is a single seed. So this moment, when we look at it with spiritual vision, this grey zone that we're entering into, which could go for maybe the remainder of our lives, how do we position ourselves for this moment? Well, first of all, we need to realize that this is rich with crises, but yes, rich with opportunity for the church, for believers. How do we posture ourselves? We look for the seeds of renewal. Seeds are transports of potential in the natural world. They are carriers of the future. So Israeli scientists recently germinated seeds that they'd found in an archaeological dig in Herod's temple 2,000 years later. For that seed to be regerminated, all it needed was the right environment. Think back to the parable of the sower. What is the right environment that Jesus is talking about? Yes, there are the people who are going to have that seed strangled by the worries of the age. There are people who are going to have it strangled by the deception of wealth. Wealth, which gives us this false belief that we can do it in our own strength. But in a Krakatoa moment, we've realized that we can't do it. Who is a pastor when they can't gather a community? Who is a believer when their friends around them are not cheering on? How do we interact with the Holy Spirit when the sounds of worship in a room and the bass and the drums are going, when that's not there and you're singing slightly off key to a screen in your lounge room? Seeds pass on their DNA across time and space. This is also true of spiritual seeds. Krakatoa was rebirthed with a handful of seeds. And I believe at this moment, the spiritual eyes that I have is, yes, there are challenges coming, but I have come to New Zealand. I am speaking to you tonight because I actually believe that there are seeds in this room. During this time, some of you have experienced a strange kind of personal renewal in the midst of all the crises. Some of you have seen friends walk away. Some of you have had to ask the question, who am I in Christ? When one of the markers around me, which I define that by, and the friends and relationships and things that I could do before aren't there. And God's done stuff in this time. My friend who I hadn't seen for many years. I think about the people who left my church, but I'm thinking of these new seed stories. My friend who had not seen for years, he became a Christian when we were both around 16. Didn't come, disappeared, thought he was gone. The shock of when we regathered in Melbourne and he walks in the door, tells me this incredible story, how he was running away from God and he was going to go back and he felt called to his mum. His mum's this Christian and his car breaks down at the moment he was about to turn back and he gets out to fix the car and the car rolls on his foot and he's standing there by the side of the road and actually he's got the car is on his foot. He can't go home. He has to go to his mum and talk about God. And he just feels God say to him, I'm putting this car on your foot because you're not going back again. I mean, these are seeds, these are stories which you're not going to hear on the news, but these seeds are out there. And I've spoken to people across the world. There are seeds being scattered in the world. One of the things I felt before the pandemic kicked in, I felt God say to me, Mark, in the world, over the next few years, you're going to encounter people who I'm doing a new thing, who a spiritual renewal's been happening inside of them in very hidden ways. Hidden calls to commitment to God that no one will see. The developing of spiritual authority away from any platform and positional leadership. And I will never forget, I said that in Vancouver, one of the last talks I did before the pandemic. And I had these guys, about 4 or 5 guys who didn't know each other, come up afterwards and they sort of shook hands. I said, you're the cohort. God is building a cohort and a remnant across the world. There are seeds of personal renewal. Personal renewal precedes corporate change. Personal renewal is something that God does. It often follows crises. I think it goes like this. Crises precedes renewal. Personal renewal leads to corporate change. And when you've got this personal renewal happening, these seeds scattered in a place, and that personal renewal germinates and begins to grow together, you also then have seeds of the remnant in your midst. We're going to see big churches and big denominations go down in our lifetime, maybe in the next year. But also what is happening in the world with spiritual eyes is that God is growing a remnant. What I noticed is when my church came back, it looked completely different. People I thought were rusted on were gone. We lost people. But I felt who was returning was a remnant. Who was coming back? This was the story, many of them were millennials who came back and said, the last 2 years, my friends have completely deconstructed their faith. They've walked away. I'm the last one, but I'm staying. And we're connecting them now. So actually, when you're in a battle, it's not the size of the church, it's the size of the remnant in your church. The cultural, Christian, habitual, bum on seat, turn her up every week thing is over. It's not going to cut it anymore in the progressive secular West. But actually, you don't need to have that. What you need is actually a remnant. And remnants form around a kernel. What is a kernel? A kernel is a renewed believer. Who has God placed around you at this moment? Who is the God Sower? Who are the conversations that you need to have, not just because you know each other from the Christian world, but the proper conversation that says, yeah, we know each other. We've been to this youth camp thing. We studied there. We did this. We've been at church. We dated that girl back then. But, mate, what's God doing in you? Let's go deep. As the world goes shallow, let's go deep. So first of all, the seed of personal renewal. The second thing is the seed of the remnant in your midst. The other thing I believe that God is scattering at this moment is the seed of courage. We live in a world which has been trying to move towards the future through being mired in committee thinking, consensus at the expense of kingdom advance, placating to toxic and angry minorities on all forms of left and right. And this isn't just true of pastors, this is true of us all. To be a Christian going forward, you're going to make someone unhappy. And there's an element here where to go forward, what we actually need is the seed of courage. And maybe it's the seed of courage to actually move forward with commitment and conviction. One thing I am done with, I spent a lot of my life talking to disaffected young adult believers who I'm trying to convince to keep coming and stick in there. I'm done. Absolutely done. Who I want to talk to now is those who have the seed of courage that is planted by the Holy Spirit and who wants to move forward with the kingdom of God. I'm going to tell you now, leading the church after 2 years of lockdown, when many of the cultural Christians have gone, and it's a remnant, is heaps better and easier because people actually want to be there. And when you've got people who want to be there, what you see is God begins to do something. And so the last seed is the seed of embodied hope, a seed in a garden, even of burnt ground, like Krakatoa was, even of compost. What's compost? It's dead stuff and a load of crap. In the midst of that, seed planted in that soil, when it germinates, when it moves past the shell that has to break through, dies to self and heads for the light, that seed then becomes an embodied hope. So my encouragement to you, as God has been working in you in this time, invest in the kingdom's future. This is a moment we are equipped with the potential and power of the Holy Spirit when we turn to Him like never before. In this moment, it's so easy to tear down. The future belongs to those with the hope and courage to build. I think it's a moment of renewal, but also it's a time of rebuilding. Those two things walking hand in hand. So come to the end of this moment. I just wanted to pause. We'll have questions at the end. But I think this moment is not about more information and opinion and this theory and that theory. I talk about that stuff, but increasingly I'm over it. I think what this moment is about is who here in this room tonight has seeds planted in them. Perhaps there's a grandmother, a great-grandmother, an auntie, an uncle who prayed for you all these years ago. Maybe someone you never met who was praying over your mother, your father, that the children that they would have, that there'd be a mantle upon them. Maybe there's a word that was given to you at a youth meeting. Someone wrote a note to you and gave this encouragement. Maybe there's a moment where you felt the Holy Spirit speaking to you and the seed has been planted there. Perhaps it's stuck there in you for a long time. It just remains like in Herod's temple, a seed that's just sitting there in just dry nothingness. But in all of the stuff that's happened in that Krakatoa moment of the last 2 years that we're going to move into, where we realize that we can't do in our own strength, that seed, maybe it's now time to germinate. What are the seeds that God has placed in you? What does He want to spring into life at this moment? Seeds are the carriers of God's dream. And for the church to flourish in New Zealand, in this city, We need those seeds to germinate. That's the next thing that God's going to do. That's me in the Socceroo shirt yelling at you, going, come on, grow, germinate at this moment. Let's prayerfully pause. Now, some of you, I know we've got people from all different churches. Some of you at this moment just want to jump up and lay hands on each other and pray for each other. Some of you are like, man, this is full. Where's my journal? I just want to quietly reflect and pray. I'm going to allow you to have the wisdom of this moment. If you're with some others and you want to pray for each other about that seed, please do that. If that's your tradition, if that's where you feel comfortable, please do that. Others, some of you might want to stand and do that. Others might want to sort of Baptist pray like that with each other. Depends what Baptist, I suppose. Others might just want to write and think. Others might just want to quietly, just prayerfully sit in that moment. But let's just take 3 or 4 minutes here. What are the seeds that God has planted at this moment? So I'm just going to pray leading us into that. God, we want to look at spiritual vision. We want to look at a moment which seems like destruction and disruption and realize it's germination. I just want to speak out in faith that I believe that the Holy Spirit has planted seeds, prayerfully implanted in people here. Dreams, visions, scriptures, words. I thank you for the generations that have gone before, the wonderful men and women of God who have prayed this moment into being. We don't want that to end with us. We know seeds are intergenerational time machines that pass the dream of God on from one generation to another. Show us in this moment, Holy Spirit, of the seeds that you planted in us as we move now into this time of quiet prayer. So however you want to do it, let's step into it.
Mark is a really hard act to follow, especially when he does that. So I'm going to say what I want to say, but I want to nuance it in a few ways. I want to talk about how we respond to this moment through thinking about time. And I want to talk about faith and hope in relation to time. I wasn't going to use this example, but one of my favourite 18th century poets, 18th century poetry is an acquired taste, and I can't say I've fully acquired it, is a gentleman called William Cowper. And Cowper is, he lives from 1731 to 1800. Cowper is depressed for most of his adult life, like deeply depressed. He spends a significant part of his most productive decades wrestling with his mental health demons. He's an extraordinary man and arguably the greatest poet of his generation in so many ways. But he also has this burden on his back, and it is not exorcised by him coming to faith in Christ. He goes through evangelical conversion, and it actually makes his despair worse in some respects because he expects to have come through this conversion in Christ and to feel better, and he doesn't. And he lives with that for decades, and he is brilliant and funny and remarkable and imaginative and witty and all of the things that you want in an 18th century poet, and also deeply depressed. And there's this remarkable series of collaborations that he undergoes. So one of the things that happens for him in the 1760s is he goes and lives in a little village called Olney in Bedfordshire, where a very good friend of his, John Newton, you may have heard of, takes him in. And Newton and his wife minister to Cowper, and they basically form a wee community in their household. And during those periods, Cowper is helping Newton with his ministry. He's also writing some remarkable works of poetry. One of their collaborations is a thing called the Olney Hymns. There's no reason you would have heard of this except that you would know the song Amazing Grace, some of the most profound and beautiful lines of redemptive music ever written. And Cowper writes that while in the depth of depression, trying to explain the book of 2 Chronicles to a group of illiterate parishioners in Bedfordshire, helping his friend pastor this small community. So 13 years after Cowper's death, Thomas Babington, again, a gentleman I don't expect you to have heard of, but Thomas Babington goes to visit Olney to do almost a pilgrimage, a sort of a one-man pilgrimage, because he has been inspired and moved by Cowper's poetry. Thomas Babington he's one of the Clapham sect that Sam alluded to. He's also a remarkable man. He's the MP for Leicester. He's responsible for Wilberforce's marriage and a whole range of interesting sort of social things, but he's also one of the most brilliant educational theorists of his day. He does some extraordinary things. But 1813, it's late 1813, it's a really profound period. This is when wars are raging in Europe, Napoleon is resurging, lots of things are going on, there's a massive German refugee crisis. And They've fought and won part of the anti-slavery campaign, but there are still massive after effects. In 1813, the very big thing is they're fighting to open India to missionaries and going head-to-head with the East India Company, and it's a very bruising and very long battle that at that point had been going on for 20 years. So it's late 1813, he's exhausted, and he goes on this little pilgrimage, and he goes and sits, and he looks in, he finds out which house Cowper had lived in. He goes and actually has a look in the room that Cowper wrote some of his most profound poetry. And he writes to his wife, "I had great pleasure in finding myself in his favourite walk, and walking in the long avenues of limes described by him, in sitting in his alcove, and in turning my eyes on the rustic bridges that he described. The place was clumsy and uncouth, but in it he kindled poetic fire." Cowper writes many poems, but several of his most famous, he writes an utterly brilliant one about a sofa. Quite literally, it's about a couch. That is an epic poem that tells the story of the global world and the place of the gospel in it. And if you enjoy 18th century humour, it is utterly hilarious, because what he does is tells through the lens of this couch the way that the world is stitched together and the way that Christ makes sense of participation in the world, because the couch is produced with wood from this part of the world, cotton from this part of the world, craftsmen in this part of the world, labourers from this part of the world, and all of these extraordinary bits coming together. And what Cowper is able to do over an epic poem, and it is genuinely about 150 pages, is tell you the story of the way that the gospel has been writ into all these parts of the world. Those kind of poems, and Cowper writes on charity and philanthropy, humanitarianism and so forth, those are the shaping texts for groups, for men like Wilberforce, for Babington, for the Clapham sect. These are the things that these young men in their drinking parties and nights enjoy reading to each other. Again, not an 18th century poet appreciation society, so I don't fully understand why, but they love it and it shapes their imagination. And this one man, sitting in deep despair in a small, dark, frankly, apparently very smelly hovel in a very small part of England, writes these poems that go on and inspire the imagination of at least 2, if not 4 generations. And we could say much more. That sense in which the human world, the human scale of Cowper's life, and all the despair and wrestling and the moments that he is drawing together, but the way that he is able to retell that hinge period where the world is becoming global and where men and women of faith are wrestling with ways to imagine it and reimagine it and understand their faith into it. Cowper is uniquely able to put those pieces together, and he does it from a small wooden stool. He lights what Babington calls poetic fire. So, Mark uses this wonderful metaphor of the grey space and that allegory of Krakatoa, the devastated island, and the idea of seeds. I want to talk about time, because what I want to say is that we don't think well enough about the kind of timeliness of faithfulness. And we as people in the contemporary West and the contemporary modern world, tend to think in terms of faithfulness as in, what can we do now, tomorrow, next year, to be more faithful. We want to see the faithfulness and the fruit of that faithfulness very quickly. And again, we've done good mileage out of this. This is a good thing. Come to Christ is what Wesley said. Make haste. Conversion, signing up to the roster, all the things that have made the church so vibrant in the model age, in fact, require that now emphasis. But in doing so, I fear that sometimes we have lost a richer vocabulary for lifelong and intergenerational faithfulness, and for thinking about that question of how does our moral imagination help us to see the deep and long fruits and arc of our faithfulnesses. In every crisis period in the long arc of history, and we could pick on almost any, we could look at the fall of Rome, we could look at the Renaissance and the crisis of the Reformation, we could look at the crisis of modernity and the way that the world becomes global across the 18th and 19th centuries. You see two things going on, and historians often have to hold these in parallax for ourselves. You see simultaneously a series of big mark events, things like the sack of Rome, like 9/11, like the fall of Berlin, like the Russian Revolution, and so on and so forth. These kind of litmus moments that everyone holds up and goes, that's when the world changed. And yet, of course, as Mark has said and reminded us, people live very much the same a week before that and very much the same a week after that. Change happens both very rapidly and often is, you can look at a crisis point like the collapse of Rome or the sack of Rome and say, this is when the world changed. But the reality is 2 generations before, people were living much the same as they were living 2 generations after that moment. But there was a slow memory that you start to see from the 4th, 5th and 6th centuries. Our grandparents used to be able to get goods from that part of the world. We can't anymore because the Roman roads have decayed. Oh, actually, no, those Germanic tribes invading have cut off that bit. So our quality of life in certain parts of what is still very much the vibrant, living, politically controlled Roman Empire, even centuries after the so-called sack of Rome, the quality of life is very, very similar, but slightly degraded. And so that sense in which our memories deceive us, because our only unit of time for most of us is our own lives. We need to be people, because we hold hope of resurrection, because we hold hope that God is working on much longer time frames and in much more hidden ways that, John and others writing in the New Testament would remind us are truly apocalyptic, are only revealed by the Spirit and by the way that God is revealing himself in history in his own time frames. We need to think about change in very, very different time frames. So the crisis, or whatever you want to frame our shift that is going on now, can be thought of in different ways. It has been going on for 2 years or 3 years, depending on how you measure COVID. It has been going on for 30 years or so, depending on how you measure the last few decades and the shifts in the post-Cold War era and so forth. It's arguably been going on since the Second World War, when so many of our moral frames, as Mark again pointed out with the third man, were set by the categories of that war. And so much of our moral imagination from Godwin's War and so forth has been shaped by the experience of fighting Hitler. And yet now, when we see these protests, these conflicts, these political crises, these insurrections or whatever we call them, these things going on in our cities, the confusing thing is, where is the Hitler figure? Who are the Nazis in this picture? And these epithets get thrown back, forward and centre, because what we are seeing is the decline of the dominant moral paradigm of the last 80 years. And we have not yet seen the emergence of new forms, new ways of thinking about the world. Alan Jacobs writes a wonderful book, which some of you I know have read, called The Year of Our Lord 1943, in which he talks about the way in which that moral paradigm comes to be. The Year of Our Lord 1943, and from 1943 it's obvious that the Allies will win the war. And it's also obvious that they will win because they have more tanks and guns and bombs. And so this begs the question, what is the moral content of that victory? What will it mean for the, quote, Allied powers to win against these Germans and these Axis powers? And as we all know, by the causality of history, the Holocaust was discovered, tragic, deep, and unmissable. And the Holocaust then becomes the defining moral content. But that wasn't known in 1943. Wasn't arguably fully known even in even fully into 1945. The dawning horror of what had occurred, and therefore the kind of shadowing effect that has had on the subsequent decades, wasn't yet known. And we are in that space where conflict is going on. We don't actually know yet who all the good guys and bad guys are and what victory looks like and even what victory means. We can't talk in those terms. So, just as William Cowper, writing in this small space when the world is utterly changing, this is that period when, as Cowper is writing only hymns, James Cook is circumnavigating the world to watch the transit of Venus near Tahiti, discovering about scurvy and all these other things, mapping the coastlines of these parts of the world, connecting the dots, and making it possible at that point for persistent global travel to reach this part of the world. The world is changing radically, and during Cowper's lifetime, you go from it being possible but very difficult to sail across oceans to, by the end of the 18th century, becoming very normal, and within a generation becoming easy to ship large numbers of people and goods and livestock and so forth across oceans and to create this globalizing world that we now all live in. Change happens both fast and slowly, and we need to be people who are thinking about, firstly, what kind of a moral imagination are we cultivating? What is our source material? How are we framing these things? Because our cultures give us frames for the moral imagination, but for Christians, that's too easy. We want to learn and hear, and we want to recognize evil and good where we see it, but we also want to be people who are constantly coming back to, as Mark did, biblical categories like exile, like remnant, categories of renewal and hope that don't stand on things like victory or conquest or beating the bad guys or any of these other simple moments, but actually help us to reframe the world and see it apocalyptically and see it truly. We also, I think, want to be people who are very, very attentive to the way that we put our hope in the space of time. So I don't know how long this period is. Mark thinks perhaps the end of our life. I think he might be right, but I don't know. What I do suspect is that we'll take a lot longer than I hope for, for the things that we all work for to unfold. And so I do want to be faithful today, tomorrow, next year, but I'm drawing I think some of the richest bits of Cowper's legacy you see in the 19th century, and some of the best bits, I would argue, have really only matured in the last 30 to 50 years as the work that he did to spark the moral imagination of his day has really become known. The fact that we can all sing Amazing Grace anywhere in the world and people understand what that means is a profound gift, and one that I am fairly certain that poet and his collaborator writing next to him in Olney in Bedfordshire in the 1760s and 70s would not and could not have imagined. So, this is my challenge to us and my question to us. Mark has talked about seeds. I want to talk about time. What are we doing so that our great-grandchildren will be more faithful? And how are we reorganising our lives around that motif, that theme? Yes, we want to call people to Christ today, tomorrow, next year, but we also want to be investing in lifelong and intergenerational faithfulness. New Zealand is still a very young country, and we're still a very young conversation. The world is changing in ways that are as yet unknown, and we have some instincts and certainly some ideas as to how that can unfold. But we are in a period of fruitful hope. And yet, when the church has responded well in the long past to these kind of shifts periods, it has always been by investing in the long term. Arguably the most profound response to the collapse of Rome was St. Augustine's City of God, and the way in which he retells not just his story, but also the entire arc of Roman history, in which he is able to respond to critics who say, Rome's collapse is about Christian corruption and the way that you have weakened our military state, and he goes, no, this is simply the revelation of that which has been going on for 1,000 years. And look at what God is creating again. The city of God is coming into being. And he is right. He creates this imaginative frame that becomes the vision of the Christian world for 1,000 years and still with us. Arguably the most profound responses to the globalizing world are the institutions like Bible societies and missionary societies and so forth that continue to bear fruit today. The most profound responses to some of the shifts of the medieval period are the building of cathedrals that still call people to hope, because they look up and they recognize that the people who built this are speaking about a God who transcends all of our imaginations. So what are we doing? This is my question for us. Discipling ourselves to see faithful as, yes, today, tomorrow, next week, next year, but also thinking about that longer term question, how are you in your own imaginations cultivating faithfulness on wooden stools or elsewhere for lifelong and intergenerational impact? And Mark talked a little bit about biography. He mentioned very briefly, I'll just close with this, but he talked about that sense that, some of us have had different words spoken over us. Some of us have had grandparents or great-grandparents who prayed for us. Some of us have had mentors in the past who have spoken things that were deeply encouraging, but that have sort of sat a little bit off, and we're not quite sure when they will land, but they will. each of us in our unique biographies has and is being prepared for this kind of thing. And it is remarkable to see in any longue durée of Christian engagement within the world, the way that the Spirit stitches biographies together in incredibly weird and strange ways, incredibly fruitful ways, where very often family connections or personal connections that come together for a few weeks or a few years fruit 3 generations later in ways that no one could expect. And so cultivating those kind of things and listening carefully for what the Spirit is doing is one of the unique charisms, the unique gifts that we can all bring to this. So it's interesting saying this to this kind of the room, because when I look out, I recognize so many of you. And for some of you, I know how our families and friends and works are connected. And New Zealand is that kind of place. It's one of our gifts, one of our uniquenesses, that everybody knows each other by really only 1 degree of separation. It's the best party trick to meet Kiwis anywhere in the world and go, how do we know each other? So this is what God has gathered, us. A bunch of highly connected, unusually in historical terms, people from diverse backgrounds, all with unique and unusual callings, but also called in this time to build the church and his kingdom and to be faithful to the gospel in Aotearoa. And New Zealand as a whole is not a long-term thinking country or culture. I'm not sure we could articulate what we are for beyond at least the next property cycle. This is what we can say, that we are the people who will help New Zealand understand that in 200, 300, 400, 500 years, what songs will they sing about this place and what went on here? What will they say about this group of people called New Zealanders who lives in these islands, even if they don't know us by that name in 500 years? What will they say about us and what we did? I hope that they will say that in their own unique way, we built cathedrals, human and institutional, that still proclaim the glory of God, and that people are faithful all around the world because of what we began to do here in 2022 and beyond. So let us pause there, and I think we're going to go into a time of korero and questions. Is that correct? Thank you. The thing I appreciate, there are many things I've appreciated about you, Mark, but you are someone who has lived out everything I've ever heard you talk about in different ways. So my question to you is this. You talk about this kind of looking for seeds and so forth. What does that look like in terms of your life and ministry in the last few weeks, months, and last year? And what do you see it looking like in this next season?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think part of it is recognizing, I think the biography term you just used is really good. And I think part of it is recognizing the things that God has put in your past. In some ways, I've had I don't know what you would call success in the Christian world. I've written some books and people know who I am and different things like that. And I found that can actually be profoundly disorientating because it gives you a false set of metrics. Hits, book sales, conferences, people who know you, it's just strange. And I found that actually orienting North Star is moments of those seeds. Clive, who I just met down the front here, came up and had a picture of me when, I don't know how old, I'm a teenager, with my parents, and his father discipled my dad, in university. And just one of those little sort of moments of God's grace where you realize, I'm here, because, some people took the time to disciple my dad, who came to faith, very working class background, came to faith, his family didn't want to know much about it, yet these people invested in him. So that's actually what guides me. I don't want to do the whole build a brand thing. I want to continue the legacy that God's put on my life, which goes intergenerationally of developing others. So, I come to something like this. I don't want people to talk about, wow, wasn't Mark great? I want people to go home in the car going, what's the seed in you? What's God doing in New Zealand? Not can we be like Red Church or whatever, but what's God doing amongst us? So I think that's the thing I feel is recognizing the seeds in my life, but also being a seed cheerer, honourer in what God's done in me, but also in others. I think that's And it's really weird. I think also, like, when you talk about Kappa, I identify with that sense of, struggling a lot with some mental health challenges when I was younger, and that sense of often hopelessness. And it was really weird. There was a sense where for a long time I felt a sense of hopelessness when there was this sense of euphoria in the world. Everyone thought everything was going to get better. And I was a little bit like a prophet of doom at that time, like, everything's not great. Like, wrote a book called The Trouble with Paris, which is, that's the message. Everything looks fantastic. It's not. It's all going to fall. Now that it's falling, and everything's been revealed for the mirage it was, I actually feel a tremendous sense of hope. And I actually feel like one term I have, it's a sort of classic charismatic throwaway line, but I actually love it. Go in the opposite spirit. When the world is looking hopeless, be filled with hope. When there's lots of false hope, pull down false hope. But I believe in this moment that we're really called to be merchants of hope. So that's what I'm dealing at the moment. I'm an international dealer of hope.
I wouldn't write that on the entrance fee, just so you know.
Yes. Yeah, I like that over the border.
But I'd love to hear the story if you do. Should we take some questions from the floor?
Can I ask you a question?
You may, yeah.
If that's all right. I would love to ask the question. Like one thing I notice is, like, to be 100% honest, like, again, too, I just mentioned I've managed to have some sort of success, whatever the heck that is. And that enables you to get into conversations, be in rooms with people, go to different things where you're in front of the best, supposedly, how we measure that in the Christian world. Yeah. The big authors, the big speakers. And one thing that I have noticed is that often I go there and I feel underwhelmed. And to be honest, like, we were at a leadership thing today, and I think some of the stuff that you were sharing was just honestly world-class thinking. My mind is, I'm taking notes, like, wow, this is incredibly fruitful. And, the conversations I have in a place like New Zealand are often better than in other places, There's something here. Remember, I said I'd come to cheer you on. But I genuinely think some of the questions you're having to ask in a context like New Zealand is bring out some of the best thinking in the Christian world at the moment. What do you see in your countrymen and women that they don't see in themselves?
That's such a great question. Yeah, no, that's a great
question.
I'm not Yoda. No. Well, yeah, I mean, you've obviously just set off all sorts of tall poppy radar everywhere, and all sorts of other cultural cringes in all of us, I suspect. But I'll answer this a slightly long way because it's relevant. So I've had the blessing of a sabbatical this last semester. I've just spent a few weeks overseas. It was a really wonderful time. It was mostly in the UK, mostly in London and Oxford, connecting with friends and picking up some really good conversations. And it was one of those strange trips because it was organised so late, because the borders opened late, so we just kind of booked, and then I sent a whole bunch of emails to a heap of people. So we took very much that kind of people of a peace approach, where you scattergun people and say, I'm coming through, but I really only have a limited amount of time, and see who responds and who really picks it up. And to be honest, in a city like Oxford, like, who do you literally run into in the street? And we had some amazing meetings and conversations just because I ran into some people who I knew. But I think I left. Part of what I was doing, because we've been in sort of pseudo isolation for the last wee while, and you think things and you want to test things strategically in terms of what's going on, and you see things in culture, and you have these conversations with boards and other leaders and others, and you want to, but there's nothing like getting in a room with people in the other part of the world who are running similar things or leading similar things and going, what are you seeing? And how are you facing these challenges, or what challenges are you facing? I was remarkably struck by how similar so many of the challenges are, but also how easy it has proven in New Zealand for us to get these conversations happening and to get on the same page. And I think some of that is just purely size, so it's a bit of a backhanded compliment. But there's just fewer of us, so it's easy to gather us. But I think there's also, New Zealanders have a remarkable generosity when it comes to relationship that I think we trust relatively easily, and that is a strength and a weakness. But the conditions of trust here I find much better than most other contexts that I've ever engaged in globally. And I think that's I don't think we always realise how precious that can be. And I think there is a naivety to it sometimes, but it's a good naivety, so let us please not lose that. Because it seems to me when you look at those gospel profusions in history, they're all characterised by groups of people who know that they have some disagreement and some points of friction and, frankly, some sharp bits that they'll stick into each other for good reason and rub off against each other, but where they're willing to be vulnerable together and risk loss and risk getting hurt by the others in order to be the body of Christ together. And, again, I could point, because it's where my research tends to lie, evangelicals in the 18th and 19th centuries are astonishing network builders and alliance builders, and at great personal risk and cost. Wilberforce is putting his reputation in the hands of all sorts of odd people in order to do these kind of things. And everyone thinks he's mad about some of the connections he forms because, he's reaching out to actual heretics and all sorts of other interesting people, Methodists even at one point, for example. Not suggesting the Methodists are heretics, but it's fascinating that his... but all sorts of interesting people. And I think that New Zealand has that character about us, which I think is really good. I think also, again, this is no derogation, I think New Zealand has some extraordinary people in it. And I think we have that classic prophet in Nazareth problem everywhere. I think Australia probably has the same cultural feature. And so I think some of it is also recognising that probably God in his grace has gifted us with the people to have this conversation and the capacity and the depth and the vocabulary. And we should, recognise that and go for it, while not being blind to the many ways we can learn from the global diversity and actually having these lateral conversations. But they will be to pick our conversation up some notches, not to necessarily be the seed or the source of it, if that makes sense. They'll sharpen us and they'll help us get better. But the resource, if we believe seriously that God is working through his people and that the church is the vehicle that he has chosen to renew his world, I think we should also take seriously that therefore the people in the room, weird as we all are in fact the ones he intends to be here. And go with that. And go, okay, so this is who God brought to the dance. Let's work out how to dance together. So, and I say that because I often have the experience of sitting in a New Zealand room, of looking out across a room, and this will sound possibly saccharine, so I'll just say it and you can forgive me. But you are wonderful people. When I look out at the faces, I'm like, I actually enjoy hanging out with you, and it is good to hang out with all of you because I see so many extraordinary gifts that, again, you put them on a stage in a global space, you could say some amazing things and tell some extraordinary stories, and away we go. That was a very rambling answer to your insightful question. And there's so much more that we could say about the distinctiveness of the New Zealand voice in the global context. I will just say one more thing, which is just to look at the opportunity context of us. So we're first world, but we've got the privilege. So we're first world, we're blessed with wealth and resource, as you said, historically unprecedented. I mean, we have a society that is basically wealthier than kings of most ages. We all live better than most in history. We're astonishingly protected. We don't have to worry about many of these things. We should be, but we don't have to. And yet, alternatively, we also have so much of the global conversation present. We have Indigenous voice, we have diaspora voice, we have migrant voice, we have all sorts of other interesting things going on. We have microcosms that we can get together in the same room and actually genuinely have these conversations together, and that is a gift as well. And usually it's in islands like Lindisfarne and other little where those microcosms occur that renewal emerges.
What a Kiwi! I mean, if that was in America, people would be standing on their seats, cheering at this moment, at that word.
I appreciated the depth of your. I heard one over there and one over there.
I'm like, man, that's yeah, wow, massive. Yeah. Woo. Yeah.
Should we open the floor?
Yes.
For the sake of the recording, we may just repeat the question. So please yell and.
Both of you, thank you so much for such an incredibly rich food for thought. One of the questions I've always really wanted to ask you, Mark, and Roshan as well, is you've talked about some of the things we're facing globally and going into the future, and you were talking about the future thinking. but the ecological crisis doesn't feature, Mark, in your conversation too much. And I'm just intrigued just to see, because you hinted at it once in a podcast, and I thought, but if we're to get 500 years down the track, we need to get 500 years down the track. And a lot of the science is saying, we got a couple hundred years, you know what I'm saying? So I just want to...
The first thing I would say is don't mistake podcasts for my entire output. It's something I'm looking at heaps. One of the great stories of our last federal election in Australia was the environment went from perhaps some people saw as a polarised issue to a central issue for all kinds of voters, conservative and liberal or whatever. And I think in Australia, it's become so apparent. I think we're the canary in the coal mine. And we've seen everything from bushfires to flooding, and it's something I'm currently reading about more. I think one of the things I really also wanted to do is, I realised that I have a public voice, and there's things I really believe in, but I don't know enough about. And, I don't want to go on the record being an expert on something, but then sometimes at a local level, I'm very advocating of something, if that makes sense. So it's something I'm really aware of, and I agree with you. I think the environment is an incredible challenge that's going to change things. I think some of the things that we need to do in order to address these issues are going to require more change than most people realise. And, I actually have in a number of forums saying I think environment and the economy are the next two big things. And I think that maybe even some of the fragmentation and polarisation that we're seeing will start to disappear as we realise the central issue of the environment going forward. And so much riches, I think, theologically in that space as well. So, yeah. I don't know if you had anything to say.
No, I agree with all of that. All I would say, we talked at lunchtime with a different audience about, or I talked briefly about the difference between sort of issues and problem-solving approaches versus framework. And I think environment and, just Christian care for creation is a good example of that. So for the last 300 years, one of the ways that you make change in our polities has been to call attention to issues. And so Christians have become quite adept at, issue raising and thinking about issues and doing that kind of moral or other problem solving. I would argue that one of the features of our shift is a shift towards people who can articulate plausible, encompassing frameworks. And so one of the good tests of whether we've got a sufficiently good gospel framework for our world is, does it include important issues like the environment? So it's a challenge to all of us, and it doesn't mean that we all have to become Renaissance thinkers and think about every topic, but that's the beauty of a framework and also a church, is that others, if we have a framework that doesn't allow us to think about the environment or ecological catastrophe, then we've got a problem because our framework is not capacious enough. It doesn't arguably embrace the reach of Christ's own arms. Just as, if we've got a framework that doesn't say anything into, say, racial injustice or any of the other many, many things that we could talk about. Alternatively, I think we can therefore, as people who are trying to build good frameworks, be comfortable enough as long as our framework encompasses that, and also there are people within that who are filling in the necessary detail and we're in conversation with them. So in slight defence of Mark's silence on the issue, or not silence, but the fact that he doesn't mention it in every podcast, I think that's probably right, because he talked earlier about the complex world that we've got. You simply can't talk about everything all the time in every breath, and somehow our morally requires us to on certain litmus test issues. I think we want to resist that by saying, no, we're now having a conversation about frameworks. And how do we think about all of these issues, including these important ones, not are we saying the right political thing on an issue, if that makes sense.
Good.
Back.
Hi. So obviously you probably pretty well aware of stuff that's been happening, so with this context, the podcast The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, and the whole look at mega churches, and we've had a lot of stuff. Obviously, there's been a lot of stuff happening in Australia. There's been a lot of stuff that's been happening in our own backyard in New Zealand. And so my question is, that as context, do you think that is it demonic attack, or is it God's judgment on the church Or is it somewhere kind of lies in between that, where God's shaking the foundations and bringing sort of renewal in the church?
Well, you said three things. I just missed the first one. Sorry.
Do you think it's like a demonic attack, God's judgment on the church? Or is it somewhere kind of in between where God's like shaking the foundations and kind of starting to bring a renewal or like a new revision of what church is, what church should be?
Do you guys hear the question? Do we need to repeat? You got the question?
I would say there's elements of all of the above. I've had a few people ask me about this, and the first thing I would say is that these kind of dynamics don't just happen at a particular scale. I know of a number of issues very similar happening in house churches, small, emerging church type churches, medium-sized churches, and there's all kinds of, I guess, toxic dynamics that have happened. And perhaps one of the differences that is happening today is that the internet, in some ways, the connectivity of our world enables us to talk about these things in ways that they weren't being able to spoken about before. So one of the, I think, traits of our day is that power is draining away from former centres of power. So that's the first thing I'd say. I do have a sense that I think God is shaking the church. And look, I think that there's an element where God's judgment and God's presence are often two sides of a coin. That when we call for God's presence to come to someone whose heart is humble and after him, who is holding nothing before him, it comes as a healing balm. But to someone who is holding things tightly in their hands and is pursuing agendas that are not of God, that presence can come as a form of judgment. And, I sort of wonder if that is happening in the church at this moment. There are also, I don't have a theory, an intellectual theory for it, but I guess it's more observational, that there just seems to be seasons when things get shaken. And I think that's what's happening now. I would say this too. One thing I'm seeing in local churches in multiple places around the world is where in perhaps one city there is a church where there's been a very toxic leader. And, in the latest iteration of this conversation, people are talking about that, and that's being held to account. And there's a sense, I think of one church where I sat down with someone who told me the story of how there was a long-term toxic leader, and the people got together and talked, and they were like, this is not biblical. And they began to have this conversation. It was this really, I would say, gospel-based conversation where that was confronted and that leader ended up leaving. And there's actually a really beautiful story of renewal that's happening in that place. I know of another church where there was a good leader and there was a toxic thing that began in the congregation, and the same dynamics of people being able to connected actually then brought down a really good leader. And so this is one of the really confusing things of this moment. In one place, you'll see the dynamics of power draining from central authority, and it'll be a positive thing, and another one will be a negative thing. And I think what we like to do is see sort of trends and try and name everything. One of my things about the grey zone is there's not one thing happening, there's 50 things happening. And, my sense is that there's a great shifting. There's a bunch of stuff happening, and one of the real keys that we need to have in this time is nuance and discernment. My hope is that in the midst of all of this, in this great shaking, that renewal breaks out. My prayer is that in some of the mega churches that have been shaken, that I know there's remnants who are wanting, after God, and that God does that. I pray for leaders who have found themselves falling really short, and that they find the mercy and grace of God in that. For those hurt, they find the mercy of God. But I also think there's a bunch of stuff which hasn't come to light because it's still hidden, and maybe that will come to light. And in all of that story, in all the mess and muck of that, it's a biblical story. We see this in Acts very quickly. The church is telling its story of conversions, but it's also telling its story of people stealing funds, that in all the midst of this, that God uses this great shaking too. I think this is part of, I'm going to say it in this way. There was a great call to renewal and revival that really I began to hear around the world, I think from 2017 onwards in the church. Part of me feels is this part of that? we wanted the presence of God to come, and I think the presence of God is coming and calling many things to account. And so in some ways, that's why I think it's all of the three things that you put out there all at once. It's the demonic being confronted. It's the demonic attacking in places. It's toxic things being torn down that shouldn't have been there. And I can't remember the last thing you said. But yeah, that's my really long, flawed answer.
Hey guys, yeah, thank you so much for your talk. I've got a question around the long-term thinking, which it really resonates talking about the seeds as well as, yes, it was awesome, Roshan, when you've gone developing that, I was like, oh, that's exactly what I was interested in, is how does long-term thinking change in a time of uncertainty? Like, for myself, I'm newly married, we're in our first parts of our career, we're super excited, we're looking, we are future-oriented people. And we're dreaming of a legacy. We want to go and do that and actually plant generations for great-grandchildren and things like that in the times to come. But for it, like at the moment, we're focusing on our foundations of just our daily habits because we're like, genuinely, God, like we're praying and we're looking forward to the future. And I know that it's life stage things as well, but I'm looking for more in times of uncertainty. What does it actually mean to deeply invest in something that is going to be greater? Why you're surrendering to God so it actually does build, rather than just focusing on habits, which is great to start, but there's so much more.
I know Roshan's got an answer. I'll just say one quick setup. I think habits are really fantastic. I'm a big advocate of habits and patterns, and I've advocated for them. I began to realise in the last season, particularly as COVID hit, there's a danger that they also become a form of control. And because we can't control the world, we control ourselves. And I had a great term in the UK recently, the weaponisation of Sabbath. Where there's this sort of sense like the world's crazy, but I've got my Sabbath perfectly, and don't interrupt me on that day. There's almost a religious spirit that can come at moments. Like I think in moments of chaos, this religious spirit can come, and maybe it's a little bit different from what previous generations look like, but it's having this perfectly balanced life, or this or that, or I do this thing at the same time every day. So I think they're really important, but when in a sense the habits and the practices are driving the car, that's the problem. I'll leave the future.
Yeah, no, I mean, my simple answer is we are thinking on different time frames, we ask different questions, and there are lots of different ways to approach that, but maybe three simple examples. One is, if you think about, so for all of us, God willing, we get several decades of life. That's, God can take us tomorrow, but that's the hope, so plan for that. But not just in terms of your career and your family life and relationships and business and retirement. I mean in terms of spiritual investment. So if you're thinking you might be leading, think about the kind of resources of biblical learning and theology and reflection and thought that you want to have to sustain preaching for 30 to 50 years at least. Think about what kinds of stories you want to be telling when you're 70 or 80. In those kind of contexts, and dig the wells now, and keep doing that. So that would be one thought. So that's at the personal level in terms of sustaining faithfulness, and the parable of the lamps. That with the virgins and the lamps. The ones who are faithful are the ones who plan for the long haul and have lots of oil. And though Christ might return tomorrow, or our bus may come tomorrow, I think those of us who plan to go, what are we doing to make sure that we will sustain it? This is not an advertisement, but it's why I run a theological college, because because our faithfulness will be in the lives of those who we invest in and those who study with us, and they invest in themselves and those around them, but actually hopefully in their great-grandchildren. It's because we're trying to set and chain long motions, which makes metrics very difficult, but that's the vision. So that's one thought. The second one is then it changes your strategic thinking as leaders and those, because you ask different questions. So one of the best questions I know in terms of starting from a blank sheet of paper for a strat plan is, what do we wish they'd done 40 or 50 years ago? Let's try and do that. Because that's when you're thinking about the kinds of seeds that might have been planted a generation ago or 2 generations ago that you wish you were bearing the fruit of, and you know that in doing that it will probably be quite costly in the present, but etc. So those kind of questions I think are very meaningful, and they can be meaningful at church and congregational levels as well, because again, it's not always obvious that when you've got 3 infants in a congregation of mostly young adults, that you would invest in a Sunday school or in a creche and a formational pathway. But rather than backfilling, which is what most of us do, and been guilty, where we backfill. Actually think, what is it to grow these young people? We've got 3, maybe we'll have more, but we've got 3, that's faithful. So let's think about a pathway through to adulthood for them when they're born. Those kind of basic questions, and which is at one level costly and inefficient, but we're not called to be efficient. We're called to be stewards, and that's a little different. So those kind of questions are how I would frame it. And then some of it is also just that message of, in an age of anxiety, we can relax. If I die before I see the fruits of my work, fine. That's because I believe in resurrection. I have lots of images like Simeon and others in Scripture of people who blessedly saw the fruits, but let's not be the kind of people who become despairing in our 70s and 80s. Let's be the kind of people who can go to our graves seeing death and destruction around us, but still have confidence that we did that which we were called to do. And away we go. Yeah, and God in his wisdom. Who knows, you might be I told a story about an 18th century poet this evening. I'm drawing on I'm borrowing his faithfulness for you. Who knows what God will bring in his church in terms of borrowing your faithfulnesses over the next 3 or 4 decades, sorry. So that 3 examples, but hopefully that helps in terms of how you might subtly shift your thinking.
And I would just add, in some ways, I also think it's like continuing to also have that vision. So there's that element of, I want to invest beyond myself. I want to have these patterns. I don't want them to run me, but I want to keep being formed in Jesus. I think what often you do, you meet someone like yourself in 15 years and it's like, I'm sort of like, oh, the fire's gone out. Do you know what I mean? And like that vision's gone, and particularly when your peers stop doing it and stuff like that. So to continuing to do that and have that heart, until, as you said, the bus comes or Jesus returns. That's also key. Yeah.
I'll just give one example. One of the best things a friend wasn't at the time in his 60s or 70s said to me when I was in my early 20s was, go out and meet a whole bunch of people in your 60s, 70s through to 90s who you want to be like when you're their age, and ask them their story and find out what led them to be the kind of people you want to be faithfully and so forth. And then don't necessarily, robotically replicate that, but do the same kinds of things. Yeah. And that's why I'm an historian, because I just get to tell more of those stories and read more of those stories who I could never possibly meet. Yeah, far away.
Hey, so I think it was in our lockdown last year. There was this gay conversion therapy bill being passed, and which you got through now. And my pastor did a very nuanced response about it. And I was working from home in lockdown, and I was watching these comments unfold, and it was just really fascinating to me because he managed to really anger people on the hard left and the right. So, one end the fundamentalist types, and the other they were sort of woke, for lack of a better term, types, sort of, in the city, sort of, Green Party, those things. And so basically, it was really fascinating to me, and I was talking to a friend about it, that I could just never be. I feel like in this day and age, if you're a pastor, you're constantly tiptoeing around both extremes. I said to him, I couldn't deal with that. I feel like whatever I put out, I'm going to upset people, both ends of the spectrum. Damn to do, damn to done, even regards to how nuanced it is. Especially in this age where we're so, everything's so politicized, especially in the secular society, politics is sort of a new religion. How do you both sort of work around that? And you must feel like you're, if I look at, would be, Prime Minister during COVID, regardless of what she did, people were going to hate her, how do you guys work through that? It's something I think about a lot, because I think that I can bear the thought of just, waking up in the morning and going, whatever I do today, people are going to hate me.
It's really interesting. If you go back in the history of communication, you had a lot of, probably from the 1940s and 50s, and I'm sorry, Roshan also has some historical, insight into this, particularly the next bit I'll say, that you had this thing where we went into what is mass culture. You had mass media, mass corporations, denominations would put out the magazine or the newspaper, which would be the voice from denominational headquarters, which communicated anything. There was very little ways to actually talk back. And, if you wanted to broadcast a message, you had to buy a TV station or maybe a pirate radio station or something like that. And part of what happened was that institutions realised that they were a little bit out of touch. They could just have this massive megaphone. Only the super rich or those at the top of big institutions could communicate outwards. So they created something called public relations. And public relations was a way of like, how do we not get out of touch with the public? So they became very nuanced. I remember, being a high school student and being at the shopping centre, and someone came up to me and goes, "We want to talk to you." I was like, "Oh, okay, I've got nothing else to do. I'm just hanging around the shopping centre," and went into this whole thing. What do you think of Coke? What do you think of Pepsi? What do you feel about Pepsi? What do you feel about Coke? It was this whole thing. Drink this. Is this Coke? Is this Pepsi? And it was this entire scientific thing of what are the public really thinking? And part of the myth as well was that there was a public. Kierkegaard wrote, I think it was a sort of essay called The Present Age, where he talked about the fact that there's this myth that we believe that out there's this giant called the public who believes one thing at a time. The New Zealand public now believe this. No, they don't. Show me the New Zealand public. Where are they walking around? Like, people believe a million things. People are weird. They change their minds, So we've then brought that thinking, which is actually very new, then into a world where all of a sudden you have this ability to feedback really quickly. And you've got this ability to create a viral campaign that someone with a large internet following can actually bring down a corporation. I was talking to a friend who's doing this massive campaign. He's in advertising for a European car company. And there was just like the stories he was telling me about just the lengths that they're going to not offend one particular group. You're talking like entire, massive, multi-billion-dollar companies who are afraid of some strange person writing a negative comment on their Facebook page. So in a sense, we bought this myth that we could say these messages in this perfectly nuanced way, that if we got the right professionalization about our language, our tone, we used words that included everyone, that we couldn't offend anyone. It was a myth. It never worked. This is where Roshan may have some more insight than me. But it's interesting, like around the period, around the English Civil War, there was this trend where people would actually, when sort of, religion, went from sort of the established Anglican Church or whatever, and then you had sort of had, Roshan's going to be able to do this so much better than me, and he'll probably have great stories about it. But the basic principle is this, that you had people who were turning up to churches and giving an alternate sermon and heckling. I think there was an act passed where you couldn't heckle in church act. Mm-hmm. So literally, you think about this, like we're sort of like, oh no, I've just done that sermon. What feedback are we getting on our Facebook, group page? Imagine if literally those people in the room, like, that's rubbish, And there's stories of like a Baptist church where the Quakers turn up afterwards and go, well, you heard that sermon. We're going to now give a 45-minute sermon of why that was wrong. I had a friend in the States who said what's happening now is like they'll do their video announcements during lockdown, and then people were remixing the video announcements online. Like you said, there's reaction videos like, here's what Joe Biden said today. There's always that sort of break sound. Like, well, actually, he doesn't realize this. They were doing that with their pastor. So actually doing video commentary on their pastor's announcements. So part of me was, Jesus said, there's going to be persecution. People are going to come up against you. A family's going to be divided. I've come with a sword to divide. We somehow swallowed the myth that, that's true for back then, not now. So I think that in the fragmented world of incredible diversity, whatever you do, particularly in this highly emotive, one other thing to add is, internet marketers realised that I did advertising. That was the old mainstream sort of mass media model of advertising. It was sort of sex and sort of people wanting to feel powerful is what sold in a visual ad because people look at it. What sells online is anger and negative, emotions. So that's the moment we're in. But also people are absolutely exhausted about it. I do think we're coming to a bit of an end of it. I know, I've seen some insider sort of political research, which is saying people are just over it. But I think we have to accept as the church, if you're going to lead, you're not going to be liked. The church has always understood that. Any leader's always understood that. It's hard, but in that point, I have to turn to Jesus, more reliant on him.
This is a huge conversation, so we could have, and I'm aware that time is very much in on it. I'll try and answer it super quickly, and perhaps we can pick it up afterwards, or others can come and grill us. if I could indulge one really fun historical example, one of the forms of censorship was, so you had to allow certain people who were ordained to preach if they came to you, but you didn't need to provide candles. And so there's these hilarious stories of the church warden where the vicar doesn't want the person to preach, coming in early on and like extinguishing all the candles just before the guy gets up to preach. So he can't see his notes and no one can see anything. It was amazing. So, we've been doing this politely and civilly for a very long time. So what I would say is this. So we have a double problem in our society, and because of the complexity of media and the way that we can communicate. And I think Christians are very unpracticed at both levels. And so I'd want to encourage us to practice at both levels in the church and in friendly groups, but also with friendly dissidents, if I may use that phrase, or friendly diverse voices. So what I mean by that is it's not just that you have to say the right thing and get it right and say it in a nuanced way and so forth. It's that every set of media that we use sets the term of conversation, and social media is an excellent example because the terms of conversation are basically mutual vitriol, and away we go. And and that sense, I mean, there's more to it than that, obviously. But so I think we need Christians. I often see saying a really profound and fascinating thing, but in a form or in a place or in a space that I don't think they understand the terms of engagement and the terms of conversation and what actually happens when someone says anything in that space, let alone a good thing, let alone a nuanced thing, let alone you can't express nuanced long form argument on Twitter. It's just not possible. And anyone who tries becomes the person of the day on Twitter that everybody piles on. It's just not possible. So I think inversely, therefore, we as Christians, because we are unpracticed in so many of these spaces, need to do those conversations internally. By internally, I mean within the church, paying attention not to the issue, although that's important, but to the frame and the language and the vocabulary by which we are thinking about the issue, and basically define our terms clearer and better, and then ask that question, if this is indeed our message on this, where do we speak it and how will we be heard in those terms? And those I think are the way forward, which is a very long form way of doing it. But frankly, we need lots more long form rather than, have phone will tweet kind of approach.
Elon loves it.
Yeah, exactly. It works well for Mr. Musk, doesn't it? Yeah, so look, it is a much longer conversation, but attention to the content and the vocabulary of that, but also the way that we choose to speak it and where we choose to speak it in the terms of the conversation of that platform is, I think, necessary. We know what a preacher is going to be. A preacher, rightly, is going to challenge us and pull us to discipleship and is going to speak to that community, and that's a good thing. That's well established, I think, for most of us. But maybe we need to think more widely about the forms that we speak in, because most of our sermons are now also social media posts and podcasts de facto and YouTube clips and all these other things.
And just to illustrate how weird it's getting, I mean, there was a whole thing around I drink, if you knows while I'm talking. I don't drink literally while I'm talking, but water. So there was a whole thing around Mark is pausing having water during his talks. There was negative feedback about it. There was a whole internet thing about it. I also got once attacked by Turkish nationalists, which was weird. So I've realised the stuff that you think I'm over everything, and then there is someone out there who will be offended by how you drink water during your podcast or something that offends Turkish nationalists that you didn't even mean to do. So whatever you do in this space, someone's going to find something to get you. Yeah.
I think we're going to have to stop there. Thank you so much for engagement. Look, we said this earlier, but we're hoping that this and all the things we do in this kind of space will be very much the start of many conversations. So if something has provoked you or engaged you or whatever, by all means, flick emails, get in touch with us. If I don't have the answer, I will pass on to some of our team, or if Mark doesn't have, these are longer term conversations that we want to have. And many of you hopefully will be having these already and have been having these kind of conversations in your own context. So hoping to knit that together. So thank you, and thank you, Mark. Kia ora. Cheers.